Welcome back to part two of my presentation here on the Reconstruction era in the United States. Just a quick recap on what we talked about last night. We started off saying I was going to talk in almost four different parts. We were going to do part 1 and 2 last night. We'll do 3 and 4 tonight. So last night we really went over the political climate in the United States before the Civil War, the immediate fallout from the war, and you had a few things going on there. You have President Andrew Johnson, who takes over after the assassination of Abe Lincoln, and he's really going to get into a lot of feuds, to put it mildly, with Congress. And you'll have Southern Democrats versus radical Republicans. Of course, Southern Democrats are running on a pro-white platform. They aren't about to let the institution of slavery go quietly into the night. And the radical Republicans, of course, will be the champions for the former slaves in terms of civil rights. The 13th Amendment will abolish slavery. The United States Congress will establish the Freedmen's Bureau, which is going to be one of the first federal programs out there that's really going to deal with a marginalized portion of society. Black codes are going to be passed by southern state governments, which essentially they weren't living in a state of slavery anymore, but former slaves had extremely restricted rights. And you could even argue the philosophical sense of, well, are they still an enslaved people? And of course, the Freedmen's Bureau and Black codes gives us the rise of the institution of sharecropping. And just a quick reminder here, since the political landscape of 2020 is much different than the political landscape of 1865 or 1870, this is a handbill for Democrats, but it doesn't mince words. The Democratic platform back then was for the white man, and the Republican platform was for African Americans and carpetbaggers, which is if you want to stay up on your slang from the 1860s and 1870s, a carpetbagger was a northern person, typically white, typically Republican, who came to the South to make money off of the destroyed economy in the South, or to help freedmen achieve equal rights. I also wanted to give some answers to some questions that I had to dig a little deeper and do some research on. We had a question last night: how many radical Republicans were from Pennsylvania? It's tough to really put a number on that. I did some research last night, and I was able to find 3. Thaddeus Stevens, who of course is the leader of the faction of radical Republicans in the House of Representatives. Galusha Grow, who was the Speaker of the House in 1861 through 1863, and William Kelly, who was also a member of the House of Representatives. It's hard to really put an exact number on that, just because they weren't their own political party. They were just a faction of the whole Republican Party, and it would really depend on how people are going to vote on legislation. Of course, you would have somebody like Thaddeus Stevens, who's always going to vote yes on legislation that is written by a radical Republican, where you might have a middle-of-the-road Republican who, on some pieces of legislation, will vote yes with the radical Republicans, or might vote against it. But I was able to find 3, but the radical Republicans are spread all throughout the North, and they're really concentrated in New York and New England. Someone also asked, what happens to Jefferson Davis after the Confederacy? And I was sort of hazy on how he lived the final years of his life. I knew he was arrested, but beyond that, I don't really know, or I didn't know. I did some more research. He's going to be arrested in Georgia in May of 1865, and he'll be held prisoner for 2 years at a fort in Virginia. And there's this whole rumor that goes out in the North saying that Jefferson Davis was arrested while he was fleeing Northern authorities wearing women's clothes. And you got this sense that he was sort of in a dress a la, Scarlet from Gone with the Wind. There is some truth to that. his wife, digging around on the internet, I was able to find excerpts of his wife's diary. And she wrote that he was very sensitive to the cold and had been sensitive throughout his whole life to the cold. And in the morning, when he would walk around his plantation, this is before he's president of the Confederacy, he would have one of his slaves walk with him, and that slave would often bring a scarf with him. And many times Jefferson Davis would wrap that scarf around his head. And as he's arrested in the early morning hours, he is actually wearing his wife's scarf on his head at the time. So was he wearing a piece of clothing intended for a female? Yes, but at the same time, he wasn't, clad in a dress and a corset, which was sort of the rumor that was spread around the North. He'll actually have personal correspondence with Pope Pius IX while he's being held in prison. A jury will be chosen for his trial, but before it can go to trial, a $100,000 bail is posted by Cornelius Vanderbilt, the future railway magnate, and Horace Greeley, who is a editor and publisher of a paper in New York. And he will be pardoned by Andrew Johnson in December of 1868, right before Johnson leaves office a few months later. And he'll become an insurance broker in Memphis for the final 15 or so years of his life. And he made roughly $200,000 per year in today's money. That was his salary for the final years of his life. And he will die of a combination of malaria and bronchitis on a trip to New Orleans in 1889. And I also had another question on sharecropping. How does sharecropping end? And I was sort of unclear on that. Sharecropping really starts to gain traction in the late 1860s, and I said it lasted until the 1950s. Sharecroppers are able to unionize under some programs from Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s, and that's really going to eat away at the overall population of sharecroppers, and that will eventually fade away soon after World War II. So that brings us to tonight. Last night we talked a lot about the politics of 1866 and 1877. Reconstruction lasts for about 12 years after the Civil War. Tonight we need to fit a whole decade in. But a lot of the legislation that we talked about is going to happen in that early portion of the Reconstruction era. And if you look here, I left you off last night with this map. After the Republicans make massive gains in the election of 1866, they have this supermajority in Congress, and they're really unsatisfied with how Southern governments, which are dominated by whites, of course, Southern state governments, are handling Reconstruction. They aren't giving African Americans the right to vote. They have passed laws that are known as the Black Codes, like I mentioned, that have severely restricted rights for the freed slaves. And so the United States Congress marches the military in, and the military is going to be active in these states for the next 3 to 4 years. They will be the provisional governments for a number of years until a few things are done at the state level. The states must pass the 13th Amendment, which most of the states had done at this point. I think in 1867, Mississippi is the only holdout there, but they also must pass the 14th Amendment, and they also must draft a new state constitution. So let's start talking about that. The 14th Amendment, this is going to give citizenships, this is going to give citizenship for former slaves, and the freedmen are going to have equal protection under the law now. So this is, the 14th Amendment is a reaction by the United States Congress to allow African Americans to vote and to get rid of the Black Codes. This will be enacted on July 9th, 1868. This will overturn the notorious Dred Scott decision, which had been passed roughly a decade before, saying that a Black man could not become a United States citizen, no matter if he was a slave or if he was freed. This will also allow the federal government to punish states that don't enforce the 14th Amendment. But there is a little bit of an issue here for the Republicans. What's going to happen is now Southern states are going to be able to have more seats in the House of Representatives. Now, when you remember your civics class from high school and we talk about the House of Representatives, your state's representation, how many people your state receives in the U.S. House, is determined by your state's population. And the 3/5 compromise was a very early piece of legislation when we were in the middle of drafting the United States Constitution that determined that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person. You had, once again, like we've seen many times, tension between Northern and Southern politicians, and Southern politicians felt that basing the representation of a state off of that state's population was unfair because they were lagging in population to Northern states. And so they said, well, why can't we count slaves as part of our population? And the Northern politicians countered with, well, you can't because they're not United States citizens. Now they're able to come to an agreement that they can count slaves as 3/5 of a person, which will allow the South to gain a little bit more representation in the United States House. But now that the 14th Amendment is passed, former slaves are now counted as a whole person, as of course they should have been the whole time. But this will allow Southern states to gain more seats in United States Congress. And the Republicans are a little wary of that because more than likely those seats are going to go to white Democrats. But the Republicans are willing to take the gamble because African Americans now have the right to vote. And we're going to see here shortly, blacks will gain a lot of representation at the federal and state level in the South over the next few years. So if you look here at this little graphic I put in 1858, Georgia had 8 members in the United States House, Mississippi had 5, and Texas had 2. As the Civil War ends and as the 14th Amendment is passed in 1872, when we take the figures from the 1870 census, we reset the number of seats each state receives in the U.S. House. Georgia bumps up to 9. 7 of them will be Democrats. Mississippi will bump up to 6, and all of them will actually be Republicans in 1872, but that won't last long. And Texas will make the biggest jump. They will jump up to 6. 5 of those 6 will be Democrats in the U.S. House from Texas. So let's talk about African-American gains in politics. Like I mentioned before, one of the requirements for a state to rejoin the Union after the Civil War was rewriting their state constitutions. And the Democrats are going to take a gamble on this, and they're going to lose. A lot of Democrat politicians will actually boycott these constitutional conventions at the state level, and that's going to allow Republicans, many of whom will be African Americans, to be seated at the Constitutional Convention and begin to pass legislation that deals with civil rights and equal rights for blacks in the South. South Carolina and Louisiana will actually have a majority African American state legislature when everything is said and done. And African Americans are going to begin to make up 10 to 20% of other state delegations during these constitutional conventions. And then you have the elections of 1868 and 1870, where freedmen are really going to start to make true gains at the level of the United States House, at the level of the state legislature, and even all the way down into local politics, such as being a sheriff or a mayor of a town. You see this 10-year period from 1868 to 1878, over 1,400 black men will hold office in the South. Joseph Rainey will be the first African-American from South Carolina. He'll be a Republican. He will be the first African-American elected to the U.S. House. In these 10 years, you'll have 6 black lieutenant governors throughout the South. Mississippi and South Carolina have majority black state legislatures for a time. So they really start to begin to gain some ground here. And here's some other statistics. Over the next 10 years, you'll have 112 state senators who are African American. 683 state representatives, 41 sheriffs, 5 mayors, 31 county coroners will be African American. And you really get the sense that the tide is beginning to turn with Reconstruction. It started out on very, very shaky ground, but now you're starting to see African Americans becoming politicians. They're voting in huge numbers across the South, and things are looking really good for the future. This is another chart here. You can see on the far left, I have the states in the South, the actual population of African Americans counted via the census from 1870, the percentage of the state's total population. So you look here, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana, over half of the residents of those states are African American. And then the number of office holders that these states will have, or the number of African American office holders, I should say, that these states will have, South Carolina is going to have over 300. Mississippi and Louisiana over the next 10 years will have over 200. So a lot of gains are being made for African Americans in politics. So now that the military is involved, when is a state considered reconstructed? And of course, I put that in quotes because that's really a loose term. Tennessee is allowed back into the Union in 1866. Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, and the Carolinas complete the process in 1868. And we wrap up with Virginia, Mississippi, Texas, and Georgia in 1870. Now, does that mean that all of our problems are solved in the South now? Of course not. We still have a long way to go. Sorry, I had an expanded map there. You can see the individual dates that the states rejoined the Union here. Of course, with any gains that African Americans are going to make, like we've seen this pattern, we've seen this tug of war, there's going to be pushback from white Southerners. One of the big pushbacks, of course, is the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Klan was formed in late 1865 by former Confederate officers. They will nominate General Nathaniel Forrest to be the Grand Wizard of the Klan. But they really don't start becoming organized in terms of violence until the late 1860s, once the former slaves begin to make inroads on the political stage. The Klan will be, of course, organized throughout the South, but they're much more organized at a local level as opposed to a national or statewide level. And what I mean by that is, your average town in the South would probably have a chapter of the Ku Klux Klan, or maybe not the town, but your county. And if they want to commit any act of violence, they don't necessarily need approval from the Grand Wizard. They're sort of off doing their own thing. So you would have more Klan activity in areas, of course, where the African American population was a lot higher. And their initial aim is to terrorize the freedmen. This is going to be over property issues mainly and voting rights. One of the most common tactics that they used was simply on election day, standing outside of a local polling place. They wouldn't necessarily wear a face covering, but they would stand there and just show that they were armed. They wouldn't necessarily point the gun at a black man walking up the courthouse steps, but their presence was enough to scare voters away from the ballot box. And their credo was really any individual success of a black man, whether it is voting, whether it is owning land, whether even as a sharecropper, they don't own land, but they had a good harvest and they made some money this year. They view it as a threat to the whole white race. And we're going to have to get involved once again at the federal level here a few years down the road in the early 1870s. So let's start talking about that. Let's now move on to President Grant. President Grant is going to be elected in 1868. He will take over after Andrew Johnson. Grant is a Republican. He's going to be much more effective than Johnson. Now, the the overall consensus of President Grant is that he's a relatively weak president, especially in his second term. However, the United States Congress and Ulysses Grant have a lot of success in their first term, or in Grant's first term, with Reconstruction efforts. He'll eventually become powerless due to Democrat gains in Congress. There's going to be a major financial panic and recession in the mid-1870s that I'll talk about here in a bit. There's going to be corruption in his administration among his cabinet. Grant is often viewed as aloof to issues that he doesn't care about. A lot of people feel that he should have taken a stronger or firmer hand in dealing with this economic downturn, the Panic of 1873. But in terms of Reconstruction, like I said, in the first, in his first term, he's going to have a lot of success. Congress and Grant are going to pass 3 enforcement acts. Now, the first 2 are just called the First Enforcement Act and the Second Enforcement Act. The third one's going to deal with the KKK, and it will be called the Ku Klux Klan Act. But the first 2 are going to deal with voter rights in the South. Now that blacks have the right to vote, of course, the South is going to be, or Southern whites are going to try to disenfranchise them as much as possible at the ballot box. So the First Enforcement Act is going to allow the president to use the army to oversee elections in the South if necessary, and begin to criminally charge those involved with election fraud. And there will be numerous whites, typically white Democrats, that will be arrested and charged at the federal level with voter fraud. You have numerous instances of white registrars at your local courthouse who are in charge with overseeing the election and election results. And what they'll do is they'll have 2 different stacks. They'll have the stacks of the ballots from white voters and from African American voters. And many times they'll just take those ballots from African Americans and throw them in the trash, rip them up and throw them away. And this is relatively common knowledge, and Grant gets involved with this. In 1871, they passed the Second Enforcement Act, which essentially clarifies the first one. But this is now allowing federal oversight of local and state elections if requested. And the details of this is it has to be in a town or a city of over 20,000 people, but you only need a petition signed by 2 folks. So many times we see petitions being signed, or you're asked to sign a petition and you need a minimum number of somewhere in the thousands. You need 2 people, and that's going to be relatively easy to find 2 people in a city of at least 20,000 that request oversight. So in the early 1870s, you still have the military involved. Now, when we say the military is involved, this doesn't mean that you have thousands upon thousands of troops, but certain small detachment of troops would be sent into cities to make sure that there wasn't any funny business going on during election day, or during when they're counting the election results in the days after. The third enforcement act will be the Ku Klux Klan Act. And of course, this directly involves dealing with the KKK. And kudos to President Grant. He takes the Ku Klux Klan as a personal affront. This is something that he feels is disgraceful, that is even around in America. And so what Grant does, or I should start with Congress. Congress begins having these hearings in 1870 and 1871, and they hear from African Americans who will testify in Congress about being intimidated at the ballot box, being dragged out of their homes and beaten, or having their home burnt down by the Ku Klux Klan. Widows will talk about their husbands being lynched, and the fact that they're testifying in Congress really gives this piece of legislation a lot of backbone. And Grant really is enraged with the fact that the Klan even exists. And he will use federal troops to enforce this act. And the key thing here in that bullet point is he's not going to use state militias. Ulysses Grant is a smart guy. He knows that The Klan has infiltrated white Southern politics. It has infiltrated local police forces. It has infiltrated local state militias. The state militia, they're not going to do anything about the Ku Klux Klan, so he's going to send in the United States Army to various parts of the South. There will be 8 counties in South Carolina alone that are put under martial law until they round up the members of the local Klan and arrest them. And these Klansmen will be tried and prosecuted. And Grant is going to effectively dismantle the Klan by 1872. Now, we know that the Klan still exists today. The Klan will not really reform until the mid-19-teens, roughly 1915, 1916. But what Grant does is he cuts them off at the head. And now the thing that we have to remember is there are going to be other white supremacy groups that will come about once the Klan is eradicated for the time being. So let's look at those. So even though the Klan we think it's taken care of, a lot of Klansmen who aren't arrested are actually forced to flee out west because Grant is so effective with arresting Klansmen. But there's some other paramilitary organizations that spring up in the South once that void is sort of left vacant by the Klan. You have the Red Shirts who are active in Mississippi. The White League will be a very powerful group, actually. They're notorious throughout the South. Basically, they're the militant arm of the Democrat Party. And I'm going to talk about an incident involving the White League here in a moment. And you had the Knights of the White Camellia, which they were around for only a very short time in New Orleans. And essentially it was who was the richest racist person in New Orleans. And it was a very small group, and they weren't necessarily active in terms of violence, but it was sort of a social club for, like I said, rich racist residents of New Orleans. We now come to the 15th Amendment. We just talked about the 14th Amendment a few moments ago. And the 14th Amendment allowed citizenship status for African Americans. Now, typically when we look at any constitutional amendment, it's usually pretty cut and dry. Of course, if you actually read the Constitution, many amendments are a few paragraphs long. There's a lot of legal verbiage in there. But when we think of, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, I mean, that is one sentence. It's relatively cut and dry. Of course, you can get into various debates over that. Well, the debate with granting African American citizenship is the Southern governments are going to say, well, yeah, you granted them citizenship, but you didn't say anything about allowing them to vote. And so as we see this pushback on African Americans being allowed to vote, Congress, again, dominated by the Republican Party, having a strong ally with Ulysses Grant in the White House, they decide we need to pass another amendment. We need to enact more legislation. So the 15th Amendment simply states that a citizen can't be denied the right to vote based on the color of his skin or previous servitude. So whether you are black, white, blue, red, green, you have the right to vote if you're an American citizen. It doesn't matter if you were a slave or not, you have the right to vote as an American citizen. This is going to be the last of the Reconstruction Amendments, and it will be ratified by 2/3 of the states on February 3rd, 1870. Now, once again, if we go back to the pattern that we see, of course, there's going to be more pushback from the Southern state governments. So what are these state governments going to do? They're going to do two things. They're going to have poll taxes at polling places, essentially charging you to vote. And they will have literacy tests. And we're going to look at literacy tests here in just a second. I'm going to give you an example of a literacy test from the state of Louisiana in 1965. So these literacy tests began to pop up in the early 1870s, and they will last well into the 1960s. And this literacy test largely went unchanged from the 60s, from the 1960s, all the way back to the 1870s. So before I pull this up on the screen, I'm going to give you the guidelines for the test. You have 10 minutes to complete it, and there are 30 questions. You must get all 30 questions right to be allowed to register to vote, or to be allowed to vote, excuse me. And so here we go. I'm going to have 6 of the 30 questions. The first question on the literacy test says, draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence. So you would circle the number 1. Number 5, circle the first letter of the alphabet in this line. And I know that sentence reads goofy. That's not a typo. These are the exact words from this test. So circle the first letter of the alphabet in this line. So the first letter of the alphabet, of course, is letter A. Well, in the line, where do they use the letter A first? It's at the beginning of the word alphabet. So you would have to circle that A. Number 15, in the space below, write the word noise backwards and place a dot over what would be its second letter should it have been written forward. So you're going to write E-S-I-O-N. You're going to write noise backwards. Now, the second letter of the word noise is O, and you're going to have to place a dot over the letter O. So you can see how this test is intentionally designed to confuse somebody. I have 3 more questions here. Number 21, print the word vote upside down, but in the correct order. Even though that question might be a little confusing, that's one of the more straightforward questions I'm giving you here. Number 22, place a cross over the 10th letter in this line, a line under the first space in this sentence, and a circle around the last the in the second line of this sentence. So this is a doozy. Place a cross over the 10th letter in this line. Well, the 10th letter, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's the first S in the word cross. A line under the first space in this sentence. Well, that's probably the easiest part. It would be between the word place and the letter A here. So you'd place a line there. And a circle around the last the in the second line of this sentence. There are 3 thes in the second line. 1, 2, 3. The last the is is the before the word second. Got a little tangled up there. And finally, number 28. I always read this one to my students quickly. Divide a vertical line in 2 equal parts by bisecting it with a curved horizontal line that is straight at the point of bisection of the vertical. What the heck did I just say there? Divide a vertical line in 2 equal parts by bisecting it with a curved horizontal line that is straight at the point of bisection of the vertical. So these tests are designed, A, to confuse the person taking them, and B, when we look back at the 1870s, most black men that would register to vote or show up at the polling place, they didn't know how to read. So right there, they're going to fail the test. But when you did have the small percentage of African-American males who did know how to read, these tests are designed to confuse you. This test is written at an upper high school level, and many times they were able to read at maybe a 5th grade level or 6th grade level at best. I give this test to my students every year, and I never have a student complete the test correctly because A, it's designed to confuse you, and B, you only have 10 minutes. A lot of times they'll get the first 9 or 10 questions correct, but they run out of time because they have such a short amount of time for 30 questions. You have to answer 3 of these per minute, essentially. And another thing that you could point out that's confusing here, I'm going to go back a slide. Look at number 1. Draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence. So if you're going to draw a line around the number 1, let's say, for example, you circle the number 1 and the period after the number 1. Well, did you answer that correctly? It doesn't say anything about circle number 1 and the period, so you could really start splitting hairs. And right off the bat, you could deny somebody the right to vote because they got that one wrong. So once again, this is just another way that Southern state governments are going to try to take the vote away from African Americans. And in this case, for Louisiana, it's going to last well into the 1960s. This is going to take us to Colfax, Louisiana. This is a tragic story. This is going to be the single highest loss of life in a single day in during the Reconstruction era. Thousands of African Americans will die during Reconstruction, during various riots throughout the South. There's a large riot in Memphis in 1866. New Orleans has a riot in 1872. And of course, violence from groups like the Ku Klux Klan or the White League. But here, over 100 African Americans are going to lose their life in April of 1873 in just one day here in the town of Colfax. But I have to give you a little bit of backstory first. Louisiana, if you're familiar with the state of Louisiana, I'm not. I've only been there one time, but they do use parishes instead of counties. So Grant Parish, effectively Grant County, is going to be formed in 1868 by the Republican government of Louisiana. It's gerrymandering. There is a slight majority of African Americans here in this area, and the Republicans know if we can make this its own voting district, this is going to ensure us Republican seats in the state legislature. So Grant Parish is created in 1868, and in the election of 1868, the ballots that were cast by Black voters in Grant Parish were thrown away. Colfax is the parish seat here. That's where the courthouse is in Grant Parish. And of course, they were thrown away by a white Democrat who was in charge of the election process there that year. Now, let's fast forward to the gubernatorial election in Louisiana of 1872. This is a hotly contested race. It is very, very, very close. Both candidates are going to declare victory in November, and neither one backs down. And in March, both are going to have their own inauguration ceremonies and begin to seat their own government, appoint their own cabinet members, things like that. So effectively, Louisiana, for a short period of time in the spring of 1873, has a Democrat government and a Republican government. They have two different governments, and who's in charge? Nobody knows. The Democrats are the first to act in appointing folks to these smaller offices. The Democrats start to appoint parish registrars who are going to be in charge of overseeing the election process in future elections. And they start to begin removing the names of freedmen from the voter rolls in Grant Parish. And the Republican registrars, who are going to be appointed roughly a week later for Grant Parish, they know what's going on, and they're actually going to sneak into the Colfax courthouse at night and barricade themselves in and start to restore the names of the Black voters in Grant Parish to the voter rolls. And this is, of course, going to lead to what is known as the Colfax Massacre. There's going to be violent conflict here. When the Republican registrars barricade themselves in the courthouse in Colfax, a lot of former slaves find out about it, and they want to go protect them. And so they begin to form this encampment around the courthouse. They start digging trenches. They create fortifications because they know that there's going to be some sort of backlash and some form of showdown, and they need to be ready. Well, it doesn't take long. On Easter Sunday, April 13th, 1873, a paramilitary group made up of mostly members of the White League, numbering about 300. A lot of these guys are going to be former Confederate soldiers. A lot of them will be on horseback. They even have a cannon with them. They show up to the town square. And so you have about 100 Black men encircling the courthouse, and across the town square, you have 300 white men, most on horseback. Of course, both sides are heavily armed. The whites demand their surrender. Of course, the African Americans say no. And so what the whites say, there are some women and children at the courthouse, and they say, you have 30 minutes to leave before we open fire. And the women and children leave, and gunfire is exchanged for about 90 minutes or 2 hours. And because of the fortifications that the freedmen have made around the courthouse, they suffer hardly any casualties. So the whites need to take this to the next step, and they wheel up their cannon. And this really strikes fear into these former slaves who are barricaded outside and inside the courthouse, and about half of them flee. You have about 60 of them who run out of the back door of the courthouse, and very close to the courthouse are the banks of the Red River. This is very close in Louisiana to where the Red River meets the Mississippi River. And these men will jump into the river and try to swim down the river to safety, but white men on horseback are waiting for them and kill roughly 60 of them as they're trying to swim away. Essentially, no pun intended here, it is shooting fish in a barrel, literally. And you then have the remaining 50 or so men who are still in and around the courthouse. They will be taken prisoner. They are allowed to surrender. They willingly surrender. They're taken prisoner, and then later that night, they are executed, and their bodies will be dumped in the Red River. So you have roughly 110 African Americans lose their life in the span of just a short few hours, defending or trying to defend their right to vote in the South. This will actually make its way all the way to the Supreme Court. Only about 3 or 4 white men are killed during this confrontation, and a few of them will be arrested. And they, of course, will get off scot-free in the Louisiana courts. But it's appealed to the Supreme Court level, and the Supreme Court rules in a 5-4 decision that they essentially can't do anything about this because the Colfax Massacre, they say that it's not a violation of the 14th Amendment because it doesn't deal with a federal election. It only deals with state politics. And so the Supreme Court just backs away from it, and they say, hey, we can't help you out here. And this is a major, major, major blow to Reconstruction efforts. Essentially, this is now going to legalize, again, violence against African Americans in the South when it comes to the ballot box. And I should say, too, I should add, they say it's not a violation of the 14th. I should also say, and 15th Amendments here. I forgot to mention that there in the slide. And to rub further salt in the wound, in 1951, the state of Louisiana is going to erect this sign in the town of Colfax. And I'm going to read the sign. I don't know how well it's coming out on your screen, but the sign reads, Colfax Riot. On this site occurred the Colfax Riot, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This event on April 13th, 1873, marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. Now, I have a couple issues with this sign here. Number one, they're calling it a riot. This certainly was not a riot. I would definitely categorize this as a massacre. The second thing, the second sentence here, it marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. Now, like I mentioned earlier, a carpetbagger was a northern white Republican who they viewed as tampering with state politics in the South, championing freed slaves and giving them equal rights to whites. Southerners hated carpetbaggers. And so this is saying that this marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. Essentially, this is saying that this marked the end of Republicans trying to give rights to former slaves here at the ballot box in the South. And that sign, I had to double and triple check this, that sign is still up today in the town of Colfax, believe it or not. That just absolutely astounds me. I said that the Colfax Massacre deals a major blow to Reconstruction. There's going to be another major blow to Reconstruction, not necessarily in the form of rights at the ballot box, but in an economic downturn, the Panic of 1873. This is actually one of the largest recessions in our country's history, the two biggest being 1929, the stock market crash and the Great Depression, and then the recession of 2008. I know we're at the beginning of a recession right now, and of course the numbers are still out on that, but the Panic of 1873 is very very detrimental to the United States economy. What you have, just in summary here, you have the railroad industry booming in the late 1860s and early 1870s. The German Empire is going to stop minting silver, and they get a lot of their silver from Nevada silver mines. Railroad industries are not able to pay back their loans. Business in a lot of industry is booming, but money is becoming scarcer. Banks begin to fail, and Republicans have to deal with this for the sake of their own future in politics. But I mentioned this last night. I talked briefly about this, and now we're getting to the meat of the discussion here on the Panic of 1873. Essentially, what you have at this moment in American history is you have the Republican Party really, focusing on civil rights for Black men and women in the South. And that's obviously a great thing. But now they have a majority white electorate in the North that is saying, hey, you need to deal with this economy issue right now. We're talking about my job or my lack of job here in the North. I elected you to the House of Representatives or to the Senate. And, if you don't take care of this issue, I may not vote for you again. And so they're trying to put out this fire of Reconstruction, and it's going pretty well for the moment. We can't say it's going fantastic, but at the same time, it hasn't turned into a total disaster yet. But then as they're beginning to put out that fire, they have to turn and put out a different fire. And they can't multitask, essentially. And the Republicans are essentially now, between 1873 and the late 1870s, they're going to increasingly turn their back on Reconstruction efforts. And they're worried about their own political future. Really, now we're coming to the end of Reconstruction, and the final piece of legislation that's going to be passed at the federal level will be the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And what astounds me about this one is that this is the final federal legislation that will be passed dealing with civil rights until 1957, until Dwight Eisenhower. So 80 years, essentially, you have between these two acts. And this is going to, in short, provide equal treatment for Blacks in public. So in stores, in restaurants, transportation, whether it's a trolley or carriage, they have had sort of this separate but equal thing going on here. And for a brief moment, the separate but equal policies go away. This will also allow Blacks to serve on juries in the South, finally. And what's going to happen is, once again, the Supreme Court is going to shut this down. They will shut it down in 1883. They will declare the first part, the second bullet here, equal treatment for Blacks in public. They will declare that unconstitutional, saying that Congress cannot regulate private establishments. We've seen similar instances here in America recently. I believe 5 or maybe 10 years ago, in the news, there was a gay couple who went to a bakery to have this bakery make them a wedding cake, I believe, and the bakery refused to serve them. And the Supreme Court they've already issued a ruling on this all the way back in 1883, and it's once again a huge blow to Reconstruction efforts. Justice Bradley is going to give the court's ruling on this, and this is a quote that's pretty staggering. He really doesn't beat around the bush here in his viewpoint. He says, when a man has emerged from slavery, there must be some stage in the progress of his elevation where he takes the rank of mere citizen and ceases to be the special favorite of the law. And African Americans and their allies in the Republican Party are outraged over this because, they have suffered for over 250 years under the oppression of slavery. And, slavery has barely been eradicated for a decade at this point. And the Supreme Court is issuing something that says, hey, look, you can't expect to have equal treatment in America. And like I said, this is a major, major, major blow to Reconstruction efforts in the South. And this takes us to the final nail in the coffin for Reconstruction, the election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877. This pits Rutherford Hayes, who's the Republican nominee from Ohio, versus Tilden, who is the governor of New York and is a Democrat. And the Republicans are really nervous about this election. They're poised to lose this election. White Northerners have become tired of Reconstruction and the federal money that is being spent in the South. They feel that it's being taken away from their own issues in the North. We talked about the Panic of 1873. That economic downturn is not going to really turn around until the early 1880s. And the Democrats are back in control in the South. We had this brief time period of major gains of African Americans in state legislatures in the South. The Democrats, after the Colfax Massacre, waste no time in disenfranchising African Americans again at the ballot box and reclaiming the majority in state legislatures in the South. So when the dust settles from the election of 1876, Tilden appears to win by 19 electoral votes. And there's still 20 votes that need to be counted. So 19 is relatively a close election, but there's still 20 votes out there. South Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, and Oregon. Actually, Oregon has an issue. An elector has been seated illegally, and they have to replace the elector, and so their votes will come in a few weeks later. But the compromise is essentially this. The Democrats approach the Republicans and say, hey, look, we're willing to give you the 20 uncounted electoral votes, but you're going to have to do a few things for us. So Hayes, if he gets these votes, he's going to win, and he will win the election by one electoral vote. Tilden will actually win the popular vote. But the deal is we're going to give the presidency to the Republicans and Rutherford B. Hayes as long as Hayes agrees to end Reconstruction and removing the final federal troops from the South. There were still some troops overseeing some election issues in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Essentially what the South is telling the Republicans in the North is, hey, look, we'll give you the presidency if you stop messing with Southern politics and the way we do things in the South. And the Republicans take the deal. This is a great political cartoon here. Here you see two images of Rutherford Hayes. One here holding his arm around a lady, and her skirt here at the hem at the bottom says, the solid South. And the solid South means the solid Democratic majority that the South has. And he has his arm around her. And then you see Hayes dressed as what appears to be essentially Satan. So Hayes has made a deal with the devil. And this is really the final act of the Reconstruction era. And the curtain is going to come down on Reconstruction in just an absolutely horrendous way here. Both sides are complacent in this deal. And this is a political cartoon here that is going to be pro-Democrat. You can see here Ulysses Grant riding this carpet bag over this lady. Once again, she has the phrase, the solid South, on her dress. And then you see here Rutherford Hayes with a plow representing the Southern farmer. And it says on the plow, the let 'em alone policy here. And, the tongue in cheek, they're saying, well, this is the weak government. Well, it's not really going to be a weak government from the Democrats' point of view. So what is the fallout from the compromise? The Redeemer Democrats, which I put them in quotes because, once again, they're not an official political party. It's a movement within the Democrat Party, just like the radical Republicans. They're going to take over control of southern state governments. Black politicians are going to be voted out of office. There are hardly any black politicians in the South by the mid-1880s. And by the early 1900s, there are hardly any African-American voters in the South. For example, Louisiana in 1870 had over 200,000 African-Americans registered to vote. But by 1900, 30 years later, that number is reduced to 1,300. And here you can see this political cartoon showing essentially the South winning Reconstruction. You see this Southerner dressed up in a Confederate uniform. And you see a man in a Union uniform here that has lost his leg. He's on crutches, and it said they're shaking hands, and it says that this tombstone, in memory, the Union heroes in a useless war. And you have the Union flag here turned upside down. When you turn a flag upside down, that means that you are in peril. You're in some form of crisis here. And like I said, the fallout from this compromise is going to be felt for decades and centuries, or a century at least, at the minimum. So let's talk about the legacy that Reconstruction leaves behind. In its simplest form, Reconstruction is a failure for a variety of reasons. Of course, I've mentioned multiple times, it's a whole tug of war between the federal government wanting to give civil rights to the freed slaves and the southern state governments trying over and over again to deny the rights. And essentially, the northern electorate gets fed up in the mid-1870s, as well as there's a panic, an economic panic and an economic recession that is really going to take the attention away from Reconstruction efforts from the Republican Party. Of course, the two biggest things that Reconstruction leaves behind are sharecropping, which will last until the 1950s. We talked about that last night. The Jim Crow laws will begin to be established after Reconstruction. This is segregation, separate but equal policies. You're familiar with the images of, white versus black seating on a bus, or white versus black bathrooms, white versus black schools, white water fountains, black water fountains. Those are Jim Crow laws. And the Jim Crow South is going to last well into the 1960s. So for roughly 90 years, you're going to have this essentially afterbirth, if you will, from Reconstruction. You also have this era in the early 20th century, the New Negro versus Sambo. Of course, many African Americans are well educated and are very successful businessmen, and you have folks like Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, these very vibrant African American communities in American cities, especially in the North. But as media begins to explode in the early 20th century with radio and movies, you have the image of Sambo, the African American who is dumb and lazy. You can look at things like, even today, Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben, and those companies have said that they're going to begin to alter those images. Those are images that begin to form in the late 1800s and especially the early 20th century. Of course, we're going to have the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. We're all familiar with that. The civil rights movement wouldn't have had to have even been an era in American history, at least I don't think so, if Reconstruction was successful. And then, of course, today, in the 21st century, we have Black Lives Matter versus the All Lives Matter movement. You have protests going on right now in the year 2020, the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and countless others who still are not receiving a fair shake at civil rights. And so I just wanted to leave you with a few quotes here. One's from Martin Luther King. In his I Have a Dream speech in 1963, he says very simply and eloquently, 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. And that is certainly something that could be debated for hours on end here. And I would tend to agree with that, especially in 1963. And then if you could sum up the Reconstruction era from the point of view from an African American in one sentence, it would be this from W.E.B. Du Bois. He said, "The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then went back towards slavery." So I just wanted to leave you with those two quotes. These are some of the sources that I've used the past two nights here for my presentations. I have just some recommended reading if this subject interests you. A lot of these books aren't necessarily entirely about Reconstruction, but they're going to have huge sections dedicated to the Reconstruction era in United States history. The first one is called Don't Know Much About the American Presidents by Ken Davis. I work with some of the gifted students in my school, and I take them each year to a president's trivia contest in Slippery Rock. And we use this book a lot when we're prepping for the quiz show format of the competition. And it's essentially a great encyclopedia that breaks down each president and how they align behind various issues of their days. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. This is his memoir of his time as a slave that was published in 1845. Of course, there are certainly new editions. That's a fascinating read. One that I read very recently was White Trash, the 400-year untold history of class in America. This deals with the issue of white supremacy, whether it is overt or covert. I mean, they talk a lot about how whites treated Native Americans during colonial times, how, of course, they treat African Americans during slavery and the Reconstruction era. It also talks about other marginalized groups of people, such as the Latino community, the Asian American community. That's a great read as well. March, which is by John Lewis, the late Representative John Lewis. It's a graphic novel in 3 parts, and it's illustrated by Andrew Aden and Nate Powell. It is essentially a 400-page comic book on the march in Selma in Alabama in 1965. The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. This is a recent book published a few years ago. It's about how various Americans handled and approached crises in American history. It talks about Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, Ulysses Grant and Reconstruction and the Ku Klux Klan. That's a great read. The Warmth of Other Suns, The Story of America's Great Migration. This is about the Great Migration. There were multiple migrations made by African Americans moving out of the South and moving to urban areas in the North, usually for jobs in industry. I put both of those books in bold. Both of those books have won the Pulitzer Prize. And then finally, probably my favorite on this list, and one that I go back to a lot, especially in class, A People's History of the United States from 1492 to the present. This was published in 1999, and this really takes a look at various instances in American history from the viewpoint of a minority or someone in a marginalized group of people. It looks at various treaties that are signed in colonial times, how the Native Americans felt about them. It will talk about slavery from a slave's point of view. It talks about Japanese internment camps from a Japanese American's point of view. And so really that's something that I feel that we don't get enough of here in American history in the schools. So many of our textbooks are written from the point of view from the white man. And a lot of times we really need to, act with how, we're taught in kindergarten. You have to look at something from the viewpoint of somebody else's shoes. And I have recommended viewing here as well. There was a great documentary put out last year by PBS about Reconstruction. It's hosted by Henry Louis Gates Jr. It's like a Ken Burns documentary. It's about 6 hours long. It's in 4 parts, and it actually takes you well past Reconstruction. Even though the title talks about Reconstruction, the Reconstruction era is only about half of it, and then it really gets into the Jim Crow era of the South in the late 1800s and the first half of the 20th century. And I just also want to take a moment here to acknowledge a few people. First, my wife, who has spent the last 2 nights wrangling 2 children under the age of 5 to bed, and she's dealt with me putting together these presentations for the last few weeks, and getting up from the dinner table to write something down on a notepad that I want to remember to include in the PowerPoints and things like that. So thanks to her. Thanks to my dad also, Tom, who has been my editor since I was in kindergarten with my schoolwork, but I sent these along to him to make sure everything was kosher in terms of grammar. I want to give a shout out to 2 of my colleagues, actually 3 of my colleagues. First, Brett Cochran and Lisa Marin, who are also 8th grade history teachers at the Butler Intermediate High School with me. I started in Butler about 6 years ago, and they were instrumental in giving me materials to work with my students, and I've used a lot of their sources in my presentations tonight and last night, and I really enjoy working with both of them. And Dora Sefton, who's the paraprofessional in my classroom, she is sort of my eyes and ears, and she has sat through the Reconstruction era for the last 6 years with me, and she's been able to give me feedback on what excites the kids and gets them interested. Or sometimes she's like, look, you really went off on a tangent there, Mike, and it really bored the kids. So, watch that one. So I wanted to give a shout out to her as well. So thank you very much. And also just one more thing, I'm going to answer some questions here right now, but if you have any additional questions, please feel free to email me. I know Julie Smith has been curating the questions, but I often find myself when I go to various museums, or like, for example, last summer, my wife and daughters and I went to Colonial Williamsburg, and we sat through a presentation, and I didn't have any questions at the time, but driving away, I had like 6 questions, and I wish I could have asked. So if you have any questions in the future, just let me know. I'd be happy to answer them. So I will love to start taking some questions.
Okay, Michael, I do want to speak on behalf of everybody who's been involved, and thank you so much for what you've done for us.
Yeah.
I have literally not had one negative comment. Everybody is just completely enamored with your presentation. We appreciate the work and the effort that you did to bring us this information. And I'll speak for myself. I thought I knew some things about Reconstruction, but nah, not so much. So, it was wonderful. Thank you very much. Yeah. I have one personal question. I haven't looked at the Q&A yet, but was anybody ever really held accountable from the Ku Klux Klan?
Yes, but obviously for a very short period of time. I don't know names. Actually, it's interesting. Nathaniel Forrest, who is the actually first and only Grand Wizard, they've only given that title out one time, and that was to General Forrest, and he will actually leave the Klan in 1868 because of the violence that they start, spreading throughout the South. He feels that it really starts to get out of hand, and he really wants nothing to do with it. Like I said, there are, the Klan functions as sort of this underground group. In terms of Reconstruction, there were many arrests made. Many folks were prosecuted. I don't know the exact number, but we do have a sense that it was effective enough to disband that group. And actually they don't appear until the early the mid 19 teens. A lot of historians feel that we're sort of in the fourth uprising of the Klan. When you look at the history of the Klan, the first time that they get organized is, of course, right after the war, and they focus on voter oppression and property rights. When they reemerge in the 1920s, they're focused, of course, on they're anti-African American, but they're also anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, and anti-Jew, and so and anti-communist, I should add as well. So they really start to expand their umbrella of hatred, and then the third time they come about is during the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, and that's sort of almost all out overt racism. It doesn't matter, whether it's at the ballot box, whether it is, a cross burning in somebody's yard. It is very, of course, anti-African American. And now, of course, we've seen with instances like Charlottesville, it's back. I mean, I don't know if it ever necessarily went away, but I can remember being a kid, maybe 10 years old, and there was a Klan rally in Pittsburgh, and these guys were from Indiana, and it was about 5 or 10 of them that came, and they got a license to speak at the courthouse in downtown Pittsburgh. I don't know if anybody else out there remembers this, but I remember on the news there were hundreds of counter protesters. So you had these guys giving their rigmarole up on the county courthouse steps, but they weren't they were vastly outnumbered. But now we see this uprising again, and obviously there are certain politicians that will remain nameless that seem to be fanning the flames.
Sure. And that actually answered the next question we had, is that doesn't the KKK exist today in other forms? And
absolutely. When I say, just to clarify, when I say the KKK was dismantled, they ceased to become effective. But many of those people, like I said, they're either going to be arrested, they're going to flee to the West, or they're going to just merge into groups such as the White League, which was the group that was at the Colfax Massacre.
Yeah. So the next question is, had Lincoln not been assassinated, could Reconstruction have been more successful?
That's a fantastic question. Obviously, there's not an easy answer to that, and it's even hard to speculate. I think that you certainly wouldn't have had maybe as prevalent of things like black codes, or how property was returned to the white landowners after it had been promised to the freed slaves by the Freedmen's Bureau. That's a really good question. And I think that's going to be one of history's great unanswered questions. I mean, you could apply that to not just Reconstruction, but the future of America. Would the assassination, or if Lincoln hadn't been assassinated, what would have happened? A lot of historians feel that Johnson could have functioned as a decent number 2 under Lincoln, but we see this in the professional world all the time. There, a lot of times you see people who are a good number 2 at a job, but when they're given the reins and they're given that control, they fail at that. So that's a good question that I honestly can't really give a good answer to.
Okay, so somebody else wants to know, in your opinion, do you think Reconstruction was doomed to fail, or were there certain setbacks or missed opportunities that were most to blame?
I think it's a mixed bag on that one. That's a good question. Certainly the one major advantage that African Americans had during Reconstruction was that they did have a party that had a supermajority in Congress. I really think if the war had ended and you sort of had an even split between Republicans and Democrats, I think Reconstruction could have been a little bit more difficult. But as we see, the southern state governments were constantly figuring out ways to skirt the federal legislation, the constitutional amendments that are passed during Reconstruction. And there are certain gains that were made, but overall, it was a colossal failure. And, you know, I would say, I mean, great, you know, we ratified the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, but you can see even the way our government is structured, even the Supreme Court gets involved in the 1870s and 1880s with issues like Colfax and the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and they make them null and void. So there are countless times that, you know, African Americans take one step forward and two steps back, to quote Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah. So I'm just curious about something, and then I'll let you wrap it up if you want. But in your opinion, doesn't it feel like there's still that very distinct difference between the southern states and the northern states?
Absolutely. I think it's back in the 1860s and 1870s. There was a big difference between North and South. Now it has shifted to more urban versus rural, because you do have large urban areas in the South now. Florida was hardly populated compared to what it is now in the late 1800s. I mean, Florida had the panhandle like Tallahassee, but southern Florida was all swampland and hardly anybody was living there. It wasn't until the 1920s and 1930s when southern Florida, like Tampa and like Miami, begin to become established. Really, back then you only had Tallahassee and Jacksonville, but you know, today you have Charlotte, you have Atlanta, you have, of course, New Orleans, Memphis, Nashville. Those are all very metropolitan areas that will vote Democrat often, but it's really now the shift has become rural versus urban, and you almost have, once again, two countries within one form of government, and you know, you can see today how polarized both sides are.
Sure. So somebody else wants to know, how did Reconstruction affect the opinions of European countries?
Slavery had been well over in Europe at this point in time. Really, I mean, I don't know how Reconstruction was viewed in Europe. I would assume they viewed it, of course, as a failure the way we do here. But in the Civil War, when the Emancipation Proclamation is issued in 1863, the South was still holding out hope that they could form some form of alliance with Great Britain, because the plantation owners who were farming cotton and growing cotton, they would do a lot of business with folks in Great Britain, a lot of the textile mills, of course, that Great Britain had. So they were really hoping for some advantageous union with them. But of course, Great Britain had ended slavery long before we had. And that was their major hurdle, was, do we really want to support a country that has an institution of slavery that we are against? And when Lincoln frees the slaves, that basically is the final straw for Great Britain. They're like, look, we want nothing to do with the Confederacy. You know, this is it. And they essentially applaud Lincoln. In terms of Reconstruction, I'm honestly not sure.
Okay. So we have a very hard deadline for our Zoom webinar. It's 8:45. But the very last question is, everybody wants to know, what is your next speaker series topic?
I mean, I don't know. I could go days about the Battle of Gettysburg. We could do that. We could do the American presidency. I could also sit here. Well, I have, some of my colleagues might be out there right now. I have in-depth discussions with them about snack cakes. Hostess.
Okay. Well, there you go.
I am very pro Little Debbie. Hostess the Twinkie, and that's about it. So we could do that. Yeah, whatever you want.
I'm thinking you need to get those president posters off your wall, and then
those are long gone. That was from when I was like 5 or 6. I have big books now. So
okay, all right. Well, you and I will talk, and again,
sure.
I want to thank you so much for what you've done for us. We really appreciate it. And
well, thank you everybody for coming. I appreciate you coming out to listen to me.
Yeah, well, we're very enthralled. So you have a lot of fans at St. Brendan's.
That's good. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Good night. Thanks for showing up.